They say Nevada only has two seasons, bone dry or bone dry and burning. That summer, the desert heat pressed down on Sage Haven Sanctuary like a fist, squeezing every drop of moisture out of the air. The canyon grass went yellow, then brown, then brittle as old paper. Lightning cracked one evening, and the fire started, a single streak, a careless spark, and by morning, the wild canyon blazed orange beneath a blood-red sky. Daniel Gray hadn't wanted to come back to Sage Haven. Even after all these years, the smell of smoke brought him back to places he tried to forget. Villages burning, the screams of horses, the stench of fear and loss. But the call had come in at midnight. Every able hand was needed, no exceptions. He arrived in the borrowed county truck, headlights slicing through dust and smoke, the radio crackling with orders. Move the goats to higher ground, cut the fences, open the gates. It was chaos, but Daniel's training kicked in. Move. Don't freeze. Find the living. By dawn, the fire had eaten half the lower canyon. Volunteers coughed and wiped soot from their faces as they herded trembling animals into battered stock trailers, chickens, sheep, even a handful of rescued mustangs, all eyes wide and wild. Daniel scanned the smoking horizon, counting heads, checking for strays. "Last run, Doc," someone called, voice ragged. "If it's not out by noon, we're leaving." Daniel nodded, wiping his brow. His companion, Max, a big, shaggy sheepdog with wise eyes and a limp, waited by the truck, silent and steady. Daniel always said Max had saved him more than once, but he never explained how. Daniel checked the far paddock one last time. That's when he heard it, a thin, desperate whinny, high and broken. He stopped cold. It didn't sound like any of the horses already loaded. He jogged past the half-burned fence, Max trailing behind, their boots kicking up black ash. The smoke was thicker here, stinging his eyes. He followed the sound, each breath tight and metallic in his throat. At the far edge, he found her, a mustang mare, lying twisted on the ground, her coat singed and her eyes already glassy. And next to her, pressed against her charred side, was a foal. The tiny horse trembled, legs splayed, flanks heaving. Its eyes were rimmed red, nearly swollen shut from the smoke. It stared at Daniel, frozen. He took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Easy, little one. I'm here to help." The foal jerked back, nostrils flaring, ready to bolt straight into the fire-blackened hills. Daniel cursed under his breath. He was good with animals, but this was different. Pure trauma, raw and wild. Suddenly, Max stepped forward. No barking, no circling, just slow, deliberate steps. The dog lay down in the ash, a few feet from the foal, curling his body into a gentle C. Then, nothing. He simply waited. The foal's trembling slowed. Daniel held his breath. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The foal didn't run. Daniel moved quietly, keeping his distance, letting Max do whatever strange magic this was. The dog and the foal watched each other, one with patient wisdom, the other with desperate confusion. At last, Daniel edged closer, keeping his voice low, and managed to slip a lead rope around the foal's neck. The foal shuddered, but didn't bolt. Daniel scooped up the tiny, trembling horse, murmuring nonsense words as he carried it back to the truck. Max padded alongside, his fur streaked with soot. Back at the truck, volunteers stared as Daniel lowered the foal onto a pile of old blankets in the bed. "Where'd you find him?" one woman asked. "By the canyon," Daniel replied. "Mother didn't make it. This one, I don't know. We'll call him Phoenix, I guess, rising from the ashes." Max hopped up beside the foal, circling once before settling in with his chin on his paws. The foal pressed against him, shaking but alive. Daniel stared, unable to look away. "Let's get out of here," someone called. The last truck engine sputtered to life, and the ragged convoy rumbled away from Sage Haven, carrying the living, leaving the fire to claim the rest. As the sun rose, painting the horizon gold through a haze of smoke, Daniel drove with one eye on the rearview mirror. In the truck bed, Max and Phoenix huddled together, one old dog, one orphaned foal, both survivors of something words couldn't name. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the fire hadn't just scorched the land, It had burned away something inside him too, leaving behind only what mattered most. Family wasn't always born. Sometimes it was found, trembling and scared, on the very edge of ruin. And so, through the lingering smoke, a new story began. Sage Haven stood on the ragged edge of the Nevada desert, miles from any town, quiet in the wake of the fire. The sanctuary itself was a patchwork of weathered wood, sun-faded barns, and old wire fences, all humming with the nervous energy of animals still smelling smoke on the wind. But inside the main barn, time seemed to slow, wrapped in the heavy silence that follows disaster. Phoenix, the mustang foal, stood in a corner stall, legs splayed, eyes wild. The trauma of the fire hadn't loosened its grip. He didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't respond to gentle words or the touch of Daniel's practiced hands. Volunteers tried everything: fresh hay, molasses, even a soft old blanket that had comforted a dozen orphans before. Nothing worked. Phoenix's world had narrowed to a single stall, haunted by the memory of his lost mother, with only fear and the distant sounds of other animals for company. He would flinch from any approach, pressing himself against the boards, breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. Daniel watched, torn between patience and heartbreak, feeling his own ghost clawing at the edges of his mind. But Max was different. The old sheepdog spent every hour at the foal's side, making the straw his bed, refusing to leave. Max didn't bark or whine. He simply watched. Sometimes he'd shift and let out a long sigh, his eyes following Phoenix's every move. Other times, he'd rest his chin on his paws and close his eyes, breathing in rhythm with the foal, slow, steady, peaceful. On the first night, Daniel tried to coax Max away for food. The dog simply looked up, eyes quiet, and wouldn't budge. Daniel gave up, recognizing that some wounds needed more than medicine or logic to heal. The second day passed much the same. Phoenix barely moved, shying from every attempt at comfort. Volunteers grew worried, whispering in the hallway outside the barn. "He's going to starve himself," one muttered. "Some animals just don't come back." Daniel heard them, but said nothing. He'd been there himself, too broken to reach for help, too lost to trust anyone, even the people who cared. That night, as the sanctuary slipped into darkness, Daniel sat by the stall, journal in hand, watching. Max lay beside Phoenix, eyes closed, his breathing slow and deep. At some point in the night, the foal's hunger overcame his fear. Phoenix nuzzled the hay, picked up a mouthful, and began to eat. Only when Max shifted closer, pressing his body into the foal's side, did Phoenix finally stop trembling. In the morning, Daniel arrived to see an empty feed bucket and two figures asleep together, a shaggy dog and a tiny horse, side by side in the straw. Daniel's chest tightened, an emotion he couldn't name rising in his throat. He made a note in his journal. Phoenix ate for the first time with Max at his side. The dog says nothing, just waits. Maybe he knows what I don't. Sometimes presence is the only medicine. From that day, Max became Phoenix's silent guardian. He would sit outside the stall when Daniel mucked it out, eyes fixed on the foal until he was allowed back in. Phoenix learned to relax only when Max was near. The Mustang's panic receded, replaced by a quiet, wary trust. A few days later, Daniel decided to try something new. It was late afternoon, the heat less oppressive, the smoke smell fading from the air. He opened the stall and led Phoenix and Max into the paddock, heart pounding in his chest. Phoenix hesitated, ears flat, but followed Max's slow steps out into the sunlight. Daniel unclipped the rope and stepped back, breath held. Phoenix stood trembling, caught between freedom and fear. Max walked a few paces, then paused, glancing back. The foal hesitated, then trotted after him. What happened next made Daniel forget the pain in his own chest. Max broke into a slow run, circling the paddock. Phoenix's eyes widened, ears pricking forward for the first time. The foal hesitated, then followed. Soon, the two were racing. Huge, perfect circles, Max's bark echoing once, Phoenix's hooves thudding on the dusty earth. For a minute, nothing existed except motion, sun, and the simple joy of running. The volunteers gathered at the fence, drawn by the sight. Some began to cheer, tears streaming down their faces. For a brief golden moment, the world was only wide sky and laughter. Daniel watched, his own eyes blurring, overcome by the raw power of healing and motion. When Max slowed, Phoenix came up beside him, snorting, sides heaving. The foal nipped playfully at the dog's shaggy fur. Max wagged his tail and flopped into the grass, rolling onto his back with a groan. Phoenix mirrored the motion, rolling, stretching, then pressing close to Max's side as if anchoring himself to the earth. Daniel leaned on the fence, whispering, "They're healing each other." For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a lie. From that day forward, the dog and the Mustang became inseparable. Max never left Phoenix's side, napping together in the dust, walking side by side in the pasture, inventing a new language of glances, sighs, and soft nudges. Phoenix began to mimic Max, lying down when the dog did, stretching in the same way, even snorting like a dog at feeding time. The other animals took notice. The volunteers began calling them the brothers, a pair bound not by blood but by something deeper, pain recognized, comfort given, trust earned. As the days stretched on, the wounds of the fire receded, but the bond between Max and Phoenix only grew. Daniel found himself sleeping better at night, the weight on his chest lighter. Sometimes he'd wake to find Max curled at the foot of his bed, Phoenix's soft nickering drifting through the open window. He began to believe, quietly, that if these two broken souls could find each other in the ashes, maybe he could too. Maybe trust and love weren't out of reach after all. What nobody at Sage Haven could see, as the sun set over the sanctuary and the desert cooled, was just how far the healing would go, or what storms still waited on the horizon for this unlikely family. But for now, in the safety of each other's company, Phoenix and Max had found a reason to stay. And sometimes, in a world full of loss, that's enough to begin again. The days after the fire unfolded in a gentle rhythm at Sage Haven, each sunrise stretching longer, each night softer than the last, while the land still carried scars, blackened fence posts, scorched brush, the smoky taste in the wind. The heart of the sanctuary began to heal in a way that defied logic or even hope. Phoenix, once a bundle of raw nerves, found his world expanding bit by bit. He no longer pressed into the corner of his stall. Now, when Max wandered to the doorway, the foal would lift his head, ears forward, waiting. It became routine. Every morning, Daniel would open the barn doors as the sky blushed with the first light. Max would pad softly down the aisle, his nails clicking on old concrete, while Phoenix waited, an anxious but eager presence at the gate. If Daniel or the volunteers tried to coax Phoenix outside alone, he would balk, trembling, eyes rolling. But if Max went first, trotting a few steps, then pausing with a calm glance, the foal followed every time. It became a silent dance, an unspoken agreement between old dog and young horse, together or not at all. Their daily routine settled into something both ordinary and miraculous. Max and Phoenix would move together through the pasture in the morning, the Mustang's slender legs beside the sheepdog's steady gait. They'd wander toward the far fence, where the sage grew thick and wild, then return, always together. Phoenix copied Max's every movement, dropping to his knees to roll in the dust when Max did, stretching in the long, slow way that dogs do after a nap, even flicking his tail in a slow, sweeping motion that seemed more canine than equine. Some afternoons they'd both collapse under the old cottonwood tree, the air shimmering with heat. Daniel would watch from a distance, leaning against a fence post with his battered leather journal in hand. At first he wrote out of habit, as if documenting their progress for some distant vet or animal behaviorist. But as days passed, his entries became less about medicine and more about wonder. Phoenix naps with Max now, not beside, but on top, his muzzle buried in Max's side, as if he needs that heartbeat to steady his own. They breathe together, fall asleep together, even dream together, I think. Max never startles, never pulls away. I've never seen anything like it. The other animals watch too. The sanctuary's rescued goats and chickens kept their distance at first, wary of the new pair. But as Max and Phoenix claimed the paddock as their own, a kind of calm spread. The goats grew bolder, drifting closer when the dog and foal were at ease. Even the old rooster stopped picking fights. Volunteers began to refer to the pair simply as the brothers, and more than one person found an excuse to linger by the fence just to watch their gentle routines. It wasn't just Phoenix who changed. Daniel noticed it in himself, how he no longer jolted awake every night, sweating, heart racing from memories of far-off places and things he couldn't forget. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war grew less frequent, softer at the edges. One night, he slept all the way through until dawn, the first time in years. When he awoke, Max was at his feet, and through the window, Phoenix nickered, a soft, welcoming sound. Daniel wrote in his journal that morning, "If they can trust again, maybe I can too. If Max can stay, after all he's seen, why not me?" As the days turned into weeks, the routines became ritual. Every evening, Daniel would walk the pasture with Max and Phoenix at his side. The mustang would press against Daniel's hand, seeking gentle scratches behind the ears, while Max trotted ahead, herding them both without a sound. Sometimes, as the last sun spilled across the fields, Phoenix would rear up, playful, as if daring Max to chase him. The dog would respond by spinning in wide, lazy circles, his tongue lolling, tail wagging, a performance for no one except the young horse who watched, entranced. Daniel realized that Phoenix was teaching him just as much as Max was teaching the foal. The young mustang faced each new day with cautious curiosity, testing boundaries, learning to play, to rest, to trust. For Daniel, whose own walls had always been high and thick, it was a revelation. Healing didn't happen with grand gestures or big decisions. It happened in the quiet, daily acts of showing up. It was patience, presence, and the willingness to keep going, even when it hurt. It wasn't all easy. There were days when the trauma would return. A sudden noise, a gate slamming, a truck backfiring, would send Phoenix into a panicked bolt, legs flailing, breath coming in sharp, frightened bursts. Each time, Max would move quietly to his side, never blocking, never chasing, just being there, a silent anchor. Sometimes it would take an hour, sometimes more. But Phoenix always came back, always returned to the calm gravity of Max's presence. The volunteers at Sage Haven began to notice something new as well. People came to the sanctuary for healing. Kids who had been bullied, veterans like Daniel who carried invisible wounds, women and men running from their own losses. The story of the dog and the mustang spread, and sometimes Daniel would find a stranger leaning on the fence, tears in their eyes, watching the brothers, and whispering, "If they can do it, maybe I can too." It was a strange kind of magic, something beyond training, beyond words. Max and Phoenix had their own language. A flick of the ear, a shift of weight, a soft nicker, or an exhale. It was communication without demands or expectations. Daniel found himself mimicking their patience with the people who visited, learning to listen more, to speak less, to trust that sometimes healing happened simply because someone was willing to stay. By the end of that third week, the scars of the fire began to fade from the sanctuary's routines. The fields grew greener, the fences were mended, the nights less haunted by the smell of smoke. But the real healing happened in those small, silent moments. Max's steady breath, Phoenix's growing confidence, Daniel's quiet hope. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the desert cooled, Daniel would look out at Max and Phoenix curled together in the field and feel something close to peace. In a world full of chaos, fear, and loss, the love between an old dog and a wounded horse had become the heart of Sage Haven. And as Daniel closed his eyes each night, he began to believe, truly, deeply, that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible for them all. The days at Sage Haven became almost dreamlike, a gentle, sacred rhythm of morning light, fresh hay, and the quiet comfort of two souls mending each other. For Daniel, each sunrise brought a little more hope, a little less weight in his chest. The volunteers noticed the change not just in Phoenix and Max, but in Daniel too. He laughed more, lingered longer with the animals, and sometimes joined in their easy banter, a warmth in his eyes that had been missing for years. But just as the sanctuary began to feel whole again, change arrived in the form of a letter. It came one bright Monday, delivered with the rest of the mail, a thin, elegant envelope bearing the seal of the Green Mountain Equine Therapy Center in Vermont. Daniel almost threw it away, thinking it another flyer, but curiosity got the better of him. He tore it open at the kitchen table, Max at his feet and Phoenix napping outside in a patch of morning sun. Inside was a formal letter and a glossy pamphlet. The letter was addressed to Dr. Daniel Gray, Sage Haven Sanctuary, and it began with gentle praise for the work Sage Haven was doing. But it was the second paragraph that made Daniel's hands still. We were deeply moved by recent news of the mustang foal, Phoenix, and the unique bond he has formed with your dog, Max. We believe Phoenix has the temperament and spirit that could make him a tremendous partner for our children's equine therapy program. In exchange for his adoption, the Green Mountain Center is prepared to fund Sage Haven's operations for a full year, as well as cover all medical and transportation costs for Phoenix's transition to Vermont. Daniel stared at the letter for a long time, his thoughts tangled. The sanctuary had always struggled for money. Every fence repair, every bale of hay, every vet bill was a small crisis. A year of funding would mean security. No more worrying about power outages in the winter or scrambling for grain in a drought. It would mean expanding the sanctuary, helping more animals, maybe even hiring more staff. But all he could picture was Phoenix, barely grown, pressing close to Max in the shade, nickering softly as the dog thumped his tail. He carried the letter out to the field and sat on the grass, watching the two brothers doze together. Phoenix's coat, once matted and ashy, now shone in the sun. Max, older and a little slower, had a new spring in his step. Daniel felt the old ache in his heart, a warning that life had taught him too well. Sometimes you only get to love something until the world asks you to let it go. He called a meeting that afternoon. The volunteers gathered in the dusty main barn, the air humming with the scent of hay and anticipation. Daniel read the letter aloud, letting each word settle. "We'd never have to worry about money again," a young volunteer said, her voice trembling. "Think of the animals we could save." "But what about Phoenix?" asked another, older woman. "He and Max, he finally trusts someone. If we send him away, what does that do to him? To Max?" Daniel didn't answer. He looked at Max, who sat quietly at his feet, and then at Phoenix, who pressed his nose into Daniel's shoulder. The choice felt impossible. Save the sanctuary, or save the fragile family they'd built. That night, Daniel walked the fields alone. The desert wind was cold, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. He let the darkness wrap around him, searching for an answer in the stars. He remembered all the nights after his deployment, when he'd walked for hours just to quiet his mind, Max padding silently beside him. He remembered the first time he'd seen Phoenix, alone, terrified, half lost in the smoke. He knelt in the grass, Max's head resting on his knee, and whispered, "What do I do, old boy? How do I choose?" He expected no answer, but as if understanding, Max leaned closer, nuzzling Daniel's hand, eyes filled with something ancient and knowing. For a moment, Daniel felt the full weight of what these two creatures had taught him: presence, trust, and the pain of letting go. The decision was made the next morning. Daniel called Vermont, his voice steady but his heart breaking. "Phoenix is yours," he said, "if you promise to treat him like family." The director on the other end sounded grateful, relieved, full of promises. Packing Phoenix for the journey was the hardest thing Daniel had ever done. The Mustang was nervous, nostrils flared, eyes wide with confusion. Max followed every step, refusing to leave Phoenix's side. Daniel loaded Phoenix into the trailer, whispering soft words of comfort, promising he'd be safe. As the trailer pulled away, Max sat by the empty stall for hours. He refused food, refused even Daniel's touch. The sanctuary felt hollow, the gentle peace shattered. Phoenix was gone, and Max wandered the fields like a lost soul, searching for his brother. In Vermont, Phoenix arrived to a hero's welcome. The staff at Green Mountain were patient and kind, their facilities pristine, their therapists gentle. But none of it mattered. Phoenix refused to eat, refused to be led. He kicked the walls of his new stall until his hooves bled, cried for Max until his voice gave out. The therapy horses kept their distance, wary of the wild energy and the sorrow pouring off him. Daniel kept in touch with the Vermont team, their updates growing increasingly worried. He's not settling, one trainer admitted on a call. He won't let anyone near. He's grieving. Back at Sage Haven, Daniel felt the loss like a phantom limb. Max declined rapidly, his body aging overnight. He waited by the gate, every evening, scanning the horizon for a friend who would not return. Daniel found him one morning curled on Phoenix's old blanket, silent and shivering, refusing to eat. Daniel tried everything: walks, favorite foods, gentle words, but nothing reached Max. For the first time, Daniel understood what true loneliness felt like, a hollow that echoed no matter how many animals or people were nearby. The sanctuary struggled too. Without the heart of the story, the unlikely bond, the daily miracle, donations slowed, volunteers grew restless, and even the animals seemed subdued. Daniel wrote in his journal, "I thought I was doing the right thing, giving Phoenix a new purpose, saving Sage Haven. But every night, Max waits by the stall." And in Vermont, Phoenix is breaking. Maybe there are some bonds that shouldn't be broken, no matter what good you think might come from it. As autumn crept into the desert, Daniel realized that choices made for the head sometimes shatter the heart. The sanctuary was safe, but its soul felt scattered across two distant fields, one in Nevada, one in Vermont, and one somewhere in the aching silence between an old dog and a young mustang who could not understand why the world had torn them apart. And for Daniel, sleep no longer brought peace. He found himself praying, not for money, not for safety, but for a miracle. Any sign that love, once found, could somehow find its way home again. Autumn arrived with restless winds and bruised, heavy clouds that cast long shadows over Sage Haven. The Nevada desert, so often parched and cracked, now felt strangely alive. Air charged with the promise of rain, the threat of something wild and unpredictable. For weeks, the weather shifted. Days of dust and sudden, furious showers that hammered the tin roofs and sent animals huddling together beneath the awnings. Inside the sanctuary, everything felt changed. Max, once the heart of the morning, drifted like a ghost through familiar places. His eyes had lost their sparkle, and he no longer wagged his tail at the sound of Daniel's boots. Instead, he spent most of his time by Phoenix's empty stall, his head pressed against the old wood, nose twitching as if he might still catch a trace of the mustang's scent. Daniel watched this silent decline with growing dread. Every evening he'd sit beside Max, hand resting in the dog's fur, searching for the right words. He tried treats, walks, even a few gentle games of fetch, but nothing could rouse Max's spirit for long. The other animals seemed to sense it, keeping their distance, glancing toward the gate where the mustang had once stood proud and strong. Meanwhile, the days in Vermont unfolded in much the same sorrow. Phoenix refused to be handled or led. He spooked at every unfamiliar sound, his hooves raw from pacing and scraping against the stall door. The trainers sent Daniel updates, brief videos, grainy with the gray Vermont light, showing Phoenix rearing, whinnying, eyes wild and lost. "He still cries at night," one of them wrote. "He calls for something none of us can give." Daniel tried not to blame himself, but guilt crept into every quiet moment. He filled pages in his journal with regrets, with memories of the fire and the fields, with sketches of Phoenix and Max running circles in the dusk. The volunteers did what they could, but their efforts felt hollow. Even the sanctuary's rescued animals seemed subdued, moving in slow patterns as if mourning alongside their caretakers. Then, on a Wednesday that started like any other, the weather broke. Thunder rolled through the early afternoon, shaking the window panes. Daniel stood at the kitchen sink, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, watching as the sky turned greenish-black. In moments, rain hammered down, harder than any storm he could remember. Water sheeted off the roof, turning the yard into a muddy river. A volunteer burst through the door, breathless. "The creek's rising. It's coming fast. Animals are panicking." Daniel sprang into motion, heart pounding. He grabbed his raincoat, shouted orders to the team. They ran from barn to barn, urging sheep and goats toward higher ground, coaxing the old mare out of her shelter. The chickens were herded into crates, the dogs rounded up and leashed except for Max, who stood, unmoving, by Phoenix's stall. "Max, come," Daniel pleaded, but the old sheepdog only looked at him with a deep, abiding sorrow. Lightning flashed, illuminating the world in stark, white relief. The floodwater was already at the edge of the paddock. Daniel dashed back, slipping in the mud, rain stinging his face. He scooped Max up in his arms, no easy feat, with the dog heavy and limp with sadness, and hurried toward the truck where other animals huddled, wide-eyed and terrified. The water was rising fast, swirling cold and relentless around his ankles. The sanctuary's front pasture had become a shallow lake. The familiar paths disappeared under a rush of brown water. The roar of the flood was deafening, and Daniel had to shout to be heard over the wind and thunder. He loaded Max onto the front seat of the truck, slammed the door, and went back for the last of the crates. All around him, chaos. Goats slipping, chickens squawking, the volunteers' faces streaked with rain and fear. In minutes, the water reached the front steps of the house. Daniel knew he had to leave. Now, or risk losing everything. He shouted for the last volunteers to get in. In the scramble, he glanced back, just once, and saw Max watching him from the truck, eyes wide and dark, head barely above the dashboard. For a split second, the dog looked so frail, so lost, that Daniel's heart clenched. He gunned the engine. The truck lurched forward, plowing through water that came halfway up the tires. They crept along the high ridge, bumping and swerving around downed branches, fences swept away by the current. In the rearview mirror, Daniel watched as Sage Haven faded, his home, his hope, blurred by sheets of rain and distance. Hours passed before the storm finally broke, the water receding as quickly as it had risen. Daniel and the volunteers returned at dawn, hearts in their throats, afraid of what they might find. The house still stood, battered but upright. The barn roof was missing a corner, the fields were a mess of mud and debris. But the worst was the silence. They searched for survivors, calling names, searching the undergrowth for any sign of movement. In the tangled debris at the edge of the swollen creek, Daniel spotted something that made his breath catch. Max's collar, snagged on a branch, the worn leather tag glinting in the pale morning light. He fell to his knees in the mud, clutching the collar to his chest. For a moment, the world shrank to the ache in his throat, the guilt, the endless questions. Could he have done more? Should he have carried Max himself? Not left him even for a moment? The pain was raw, almost blinding. The other volunteers gathered around, silent. One laid a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. Another whispered a prayer. Max was gone. The dog who had taught Daniel how to stay, how to hope, how to heal, lost to the indifferent power of the flood. Daniel staggered to his feet, clutching the collar, numb with grief. For days, he moved through Sage Haven like a ghost. He tended to the surviving animals, patched fences, swept mud from the barn floor, but all of it was automatic, his mind somewhere else, trapped in a memory of Max, curled next to Phoenix, both asleep in a sunbeam. At night, Daniel would sit outside beneath the bruised, starless sky, collar in hand, searching for some meaning. But the desert wind offered no comfort, only the soft, persistent ache of everything lost. Back in Vermont, Phoenix grew even wilder. The mustang kicked at the walls, refused food, eyes flickering with something close to madness. He cried out for Max, his voice breaking in the early morning hours, so loud the trainers couldn't sleep. The bond between them, torn by well-meaning hands, refused to die quietly. And at Sage Haven, the emptiness settled. The sanctuary survived, but it was changed forever. Daniel, broken open once more, realized just how fragile happiness could be, how quickly love could slip through your fingers, washed away by a storm no one saw coming. Yet even as he mourned, something stubborn in him refused to give in to despair. For if Max had taught him anything, it was this: to stay, even when the world turned cruel, to hope, even in the face of loss, and to trust, against all odds, that the story wasn't finished yet. Not as long as love remained, echoing in the silent places between heartbeats and storms. 3 weeks passed after the flood, and Sage Haven drifted in a fog of loss. Daniel moved through the days like a man haunted, feeding the animals, fixing the fences, staring at the horizon until dusk. Every morning he found himself reaching for Max's collar where it hung by the kitchen door, fingers brushing the worn leather as if the old dog might walk in at any moment. The world felt emptier, quieter, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. The volunteers tried to help, offering extra hands, bringing small gifts, cooking hot meals, but nothing could fill the hole left by Max. Daniel saw the worry in their faces and heard their whispered questions. Would Sage Haven ever be the same? Could Daniel heal without his friend? Would Phoenix, lost in Vermont, ever find peace? He checked his email each morning for news from the Green Mountain Center. The updates had become less frequent, more desperate. Phoenix refused to adjust. He lashed out at the staff, his hooves raw and bloody, the stall walls scarred from frantic kicks. He still called out in the night, a wild, mournful sound that echoed through the Vermont hills, keeping the whole facility awake. "We're worried," one trainer wrote. "He seems to be waiting for something. Or someone." Then, on a chilly Sunday morning, just as the sanctuary's routines were settling into a fragile normal, Daniel's phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Officer Ramirez, a local Nevada policewoman Daniel barely knew. She spoke quickly, half laughing, half serious. "You're going to think I'm crazy, but we got a call from a woman in southern Utah last night. She swears she saw a horse walking down the side of Route 89 with a dog lying on its back. A big dog," she said, "kind of shaggy, soaking wet. You wouldn't happen to be missing a couple animals, would you?" Daniel's breath caught. "That's not possible," he said, even as hope bloomed sharp and painful in his chest. "Max is gone, and Phoenix is in Vermont." But Ramirez chuckled again. "Well, this lady is a school teacher, salt of the earth, doesn't even drink, and she's pretty worked up. You want her number?" Daniel barely heard the rest of the conversation. As soon as he hung up, he dropped onto the porch steps, head spinning. The story was too wild to believe, but in his bones, he felt the old certainty he'd learned in the Army. Sometimes what shouldn't be possible was exactly what happened. The rumor spread through the small towns of southern Utah like wildfire. Over the next day, more calls trickled in. A highway patrol officer reported seeing hoof prints and paw prints together on the muddy shoulder. A family posted a blurry photo to a local Facebook group. A dark horse, unmistakably Mustang, with something draped across its back, moving slowly through the late afternoon light. Daniel watched the internet light up in real time. At first, people scoffed. No way a horse would carry a dog. Probably a coyote or someone's lost goat. But then came the dashcam video. It was short, less than 30 seconds, but it shook Daniel to his core. A pickup truck driving at sunset caught a fleeting image. A Mustang, wild mane tangled and windblown, walking with sure, exhausted steps along the shoulder. Across its back, limp but alive, was a dog, shaggy, gray-furred, unmistakable. The video was grainy, the details imperfect, but Daniel knew he'd know Max anywhere. And the horse was Phoenix, grown stronger, head high despite the obvious fatigue, eyes focused straight ahead as if nothing on earth could stop him. The dashcam clip went viral within hours. Animal rescue groups, news stations, and even morning talk shows picked up the story. Miracle in the desert, horse and dog travel together. Donations poured in from people moved by the unlikely journey, and rescue teams were dispatched up and down the highway, searching for any sign of the pair. Daniel barely slept that night. He paced the floor, staring at the collar, replaying the video 100 times. Every instinct in him screamed to go, to drive into the desert, search every back road and dry riverbed until he found them. But the search area was enormous, and he knew from years of working with Mustangs that a frightened, determined horse could cover dozens of miles in a day. He called the Vermont Center. "Have you seen Phoenix?" he asked, heart pounding. The answer came after a long, embarrassed pause. "His stall was empty the morning after the storm," the head trainer confessed. "We found a hole in the fence, tracks leading into the woods. We didn't think he could get far, but with that leg injury, and we're sorry, Dr. Gray. We should have called you sooner." Daniel bit back his frustration. If you see any more signs, let me know, please." He rallied the Sage Haven team, pulling maps and printing photos. They split into search parties, heading north and east, armed with food, blankets, and hope. For the first time since the fire, Daniel felt fully alive, driven by purpose, the old soldier's instincts sharp. The volunteers, buoyed by the wave of online support and the extraordinary story unfolding, followed him without question. Days passed with little news. Then, just as Daniel was beginning to fear the worst, a call came from a rescue worker on the Arizona border. "We found hoofprints and dog tracks together, crossing a shallow creek. The dog's limping, but the horse seems strong. Locals say they saw them heading for the woods near the canyon pass." Daniel and 2 volunteers drove through the night, arriving at dawn. They met the search crew near a cluster of cottonwoods. All was quiet, except for the sound of wind and the soft gurgle of water, but on the far bank, they found evidence. A patch of flattened grass where a horse had rested, tufts of gray fur, paw prints deep in the mud. Daniel knelt, running his hands over the tracks, the scent of sage and river in the air. He closed his eyes, imagining the scene. Phoenix standing guard as Max rested, both exhausted but still moving forward, still holding on. The teams fanned out, calling names, searching the ravines and hillsides. Word spread quickly. People from nearby towns, moved by the story, joined in the search. Children carried binoculars, local hikers left water buckets along trails, and even rival ranchers set aside old grudges to help. Everywhere Daniel went, people wanted to hear about the dog and the Mustang, the family that should have never been, lost and found and lost again. He told them about the fire, about Max's patience and Phoenix's courage, about the lesson he'd learned from their silent love, that healing sometimes required nothing more than simply staying. Late one evening, as the sun sank behind the western ridge and the shadows deepened, a volunteer jogged up, breathless and bright-eyed. "We found something! Please, you need to see this!" Daniel's heart hammered as he followed, hope and fear tangled in his chest. They led him through brush and broken fence lines, down into a shallow hollow where the grass was trampled and the air was filled with the scent of horse. And there, in the fading gold of sunset, he saw them, tracks leading into the woods, fresh and unmistakable, paw prints beside hoof prints, the trail heading deeper into the trees. The chase was on, but Daniel knew, in the marrow of his bones, that the story was not yet over. Somewhere out there, against all odds, Phoenix and Max were together again, moving through the world not as lost souls but as survivors, bound by loyalty, tested by loss, carrying each other home. And Daniel, for the first time since the fire, felt hope rising in him like dawn after the darkest night. By the end of the 3rd week, the search had become something of a legend, even among the volunteers who had spent years at Sage Haven and thought they'd seen it all. Every small-town radio was buzzing with talk of the miracle horse and the loyal dog. Even passing truckers slowed to ask about sightings and hand out coffee to the tired search teams combing the Nevada and Utah borderlands. Daniel hadn't slept more than a handful of hours and days, but he moved with a stubborn purpose, running on hope, in a kind of desperate love that defied reason. Early one morning, just as the eastern sky began to pinken, Daniel and 2 volunteers set out again, following the most recent clue, a cluster of paw prints and hoof marks leading into the thick cottonwoods beside an old irrigation canal. The volunteer who'd called him out the night before was waiting, excitement etched across her tired face. "They're close, Dr. Gray. The prints are fresh. There's even a patch of horsehair caught on that fence post over there." Daniel crouched beside the prints, fingertips brushing the mud. They were as clear as day. Max's broad, splayed paw, and beside it the delicate crescent of Phoenix's hoof. Daniel's throat tightened. The tracks cut through the tall grass, vanishing into a thick tangle of willow and bramble. Daniel's heart pounded, hope and terror rising in equal measure. What would he find at the end of this trail? Would it be too late? They moved quietly through the morning mist, Daniel in the lead, calling softly. "Max, Phoenix, come on, boy. Come on, kid." He didn't expect an answer, but something in the silence shifted, a subtle stirring, a tension in the air that set every nerve tingling. They found them in a hollow beneath a stand of old juniper trees, a place where the sun barely touched the ground. Phoenix stood over Max, his body trembling but defiant, his flanks heaving with exhaustion. The Mustang's coat was caked with dust and sweat, mane tangled, ribs showing after the long ordeal. But it was the dog who nearly undid Daniel. Max lay on his side, one hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He was breathing, but each breath was labored, eyes half shut and glazed with pain. His fur was filthy, spiked with mud and brambles. But when Daniel called his name again, Max's ears flicked weakly. Phoenix let out a guttural nicker, stepping between Max and the rescuers. Daniel could see the wild terror in the Mustang's eyes, but also something else, an unbreakable will, a refusal to leave his friend. Phoenix's legs quivered with fatigue, and yet he kept himself upright, even as he swayed with every labored breath. Daniel sank to his knees, tears burning hot and fast down his face. He reached a trembling hand toward Phoenix, who snorted and stamped, torn between fear and relief. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, voice breaking. "You did it, buddy. You saved him." Max whined softly, lifting his head just enough to nuzzle Daniel's hand. The moment was so raw, so achingly human, that the volunteers could only stand back, watching in silence as Daniel gathered both animals close. For the first time in years, Daniel let himself cry, hard, loud, and unashamed. He clung to Max's ruff, pressed his forehead to Phoenix's warm neck, and wept for every loss, every fear, every lonely night that had brought them to this moment. When Daniel finally composed himself, the practical work began. He radioed for a vet and a rescue transport. The volunteers brought water and blankets, moving slowly to keep from startling Phoenix. The Mustang never took his eyes off Max. Every time someone approached, Phoenix would step protectively closer, refusing to leave the dog's side. It was clear to everyone, if Max was moved, Phoenix would follow, no matter how tired or afraid. The vet arrived, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Voss, who examined Max with quick, gentle hands. The verdict was grim. Max's leg was badly broken, and he was dangerously dehydrated. Phoenix, too, was in rough shape. His hooves cracked and bleeding, body trembling with exhaustion. Dr. Voss shook her head in amazement. "This horse must have carried the dog for miles. It's not possible, but here they are." With the greatest care, the team fashioned a sling to carry Max, who whimpered but didn't resist, as if he trusted that Daniel would see him through. Phoenix snorted anxiously, pacing and nickering, but Daniel stayed at his side, one hand on the Mustang's withers, murmuring reassurance. The convoy moved slowly, the volunteers clearing the way as the battered family began their journey back. Word spread fast. By the time they reached Sage Haven, a crowd of neighbors, supporters, and news crews lined the driveway. Someone had hung a hastily painted sign. "Welcome home, brothers." The sun was climbing high, the air warm and sweet, full of anticipation. Daniel's hands shook as he lifted Max out of the truck, the old dog's head lolling on his shoulder. Phoenix, at first reluctant to step down, finally followed when he saw Daniel and Max together, his hooves stumbling but determined. The crowd fell silent as Daniel walked between them, his arms full of dog, the Mustang trailing at his side. The only sound was Phoenix's labored breathing and the soft whimpers of Max, finally safe. Volunteers opened the main barn, and Daniel carried Max inside, laying him on a thick bed of straw. Phoenix followed, nosing his way in, finally dropping beside Max with a heavy sigh. For the first time since the fire, Sage Haven felt like home again. In the days that followed, healing became a communal effort. Vets set Max's leg, splinted and bandaged with the care reserved for old war heroes. Phoenix was given IV fluids, his hooves treated, his wounds cleaned. The Mustang would only rest if Max was beside him. If anyone tried to separate them, Phoenix would panic, whinnying and kicking until the old dog was returned. Daniel stayed close, refusing to leave the barn for more than a few minutes at a time. He slept on a cot in the corner, Max curled at his feet, Phoenix nearby. He kept his journal close, filling page after page with gratitude, awe, and a renewed belief in miracles. The other animals seemed to sense the change. The chickens settled on their roosts, the goats grazed quietly, even the shy barn cats lounged in patches of sunlight near the brothers' stall. The story traveled farther than Daniel ever imagined. News stations broadcast live from Sage Haven. Donations and letters of encouragement poured in from across the country. People sent gifts for Max and Phoenix, handmade quilts, gourmet treats, new halters and toys. Children drew pictures, their crayon art taped up along the barn walls for all to see. Yet for all the public excitement, what mattered most was the quiet transformation in the barn. Daniel began to smile again, to laugh with the volunteers, to talk openly about his own journey from darkness to hope. When visitors came, he told them not just the story of the rescue, but of the bond between Max and Phoenix, a friendship that had survived fire, flood, and the long road home. He let himself believe, truly believe, that home wasn't a place. It was the people and the creatures who refused to give up on each other, even when the world gave them every reason to let go. As the weeks passed, Max's wounds healed, Phoenix's strength returned, and Daniel found himself able to sleep through the night, the ache in his chest finally easing. The miracle wasn't that they'd survived the journey. The miracle was that, through every trial, they'd refused to let go. And at Sage Haven, for the first time in a long time, hope became something you could see, touch, and trust. A quiet miracle, sleeping in the straw. After the rescue, Sage Haven was no longer just a hidden corner of the Nevada desert. The story of Phoenix and Max, how a broken Mustang and an old dog had braved the odds to find each other, had moved the world. Letters poured in by the hundreds, sometimes dozens a day, from children and veterans, farmers and city dwellers, people who wrote of their own wounds and the hope these two animals had awakened. Donations followed, in small bills and big checks, and with them came the dream Daniel had nursed since the fire. A true sanctuary, not just for animals, but for anyone whose soul needed a place to heal. That autumn, the volunteers worked with a kind of fevered joy. The main pasture was reseeded, new fences went up, the barns were repainted in warm, earthy reds and creams. But the greatest change came with the construction of a brand new field on the western edge of the property. Daniel designed it himself, a broad, sunlit stretch of land bordered by cottonwoods, wildflowers, and native grasses. At its entrance, a wooden sign was hand-carved by a local craftsman reading, "The Brothers' Field." The field was built not only for Max and Phoenix, but for every wounded creature, animal or human, who might cross the sanctuary's gates. It was designed to be open and free, a place where horses could run and dogs could sleep in the sun, where people could come and simply exist without judgment or expectation. On the day the field opened, the sanctuary buzzed with energy. Local news stations returned, neighbors brought picnic baskets and blankets. A crowd gathered, kids with laughter in their throats, men in dusty boots, women with tears shining in their eyes. Daniel stood at the gate, hands trembling, Max at his feet, and Phoenix nuzzling his shoulder, the Mustang's mane braided with a ribbon sent from a little girl in Vermont. He gave a short speech, nothing fancy, just a thank you, his voice rough with emotion, as he talked about what Max and Phoenix had taught him. "If you want to heal," he said, "sometimes you don't need words or even hope. Sometimes you just need someone who won't leave, no matter how bad it gets." The crowd cheered, but more than a few people simply wiped their eyes, holding close the people they loved. With a gentle gesture, Daniel opened the gate, and Max ambled in, slow but sure, his limp less pronounced now. Phoenix followed, stepping into the tall grass, tossing his head as if to test the wind, then breaking into a slow, jubilant trot. The pair made wide, looping circles, stopping now and then to greet other animals or press close to visitors. There was a kind of awe in the air, the feeling that everyone present was witnessing something extraordinary, yet comfortingly simple. Two souls who refused to be alone. That first weekend, children arrived from a local foster program. Some came with foster parents, others with social workers, all carrying invisible scars. Daniel watched as the kids approached Max and Phoenix, at first shy, hanging back, then inching closer when they saw how gentle the Mustang was, how patient the dog. Max allowed himself to be petted and hugged, while Phoenix would nuzzle a small hand, his breath soft as a promise. Other weekends, veterans arrived, Many from support groups that Daniel himself had attended in his darkest days. They came with canes, with wheelchairs, or just with heavy hearts and heavy stories. Some just watched the animals, some sat quietly in the sun, some talked, at first only with Daniel, but slowly with each other. The silence that so often haunted their lives seemed to lighten in the brothers' field. People laughed, sometimes for the first time in years. Tears were shed, but without shame. Daniel began teaching again, but not the way he once had. Instead of drills or rigid lessons, he taught the art of listening, how to watch a horse's body language, how to understand a dog's silent presence. He showed visitors how to move with patience, how to build trust, not through force, but through stillness. Healing, he'd say, isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about allowing someone to be seen just as they are. The field became a magnet for those needing something beyond words. Sometimes it was just a mother grieving the loss of her husband, coming to sit in the wildflowers while Max pressed his head to her lap. Sometimes it was a teenager who had run out of foster homes, finding comfort in the steady, reassuring presence of Phoenix as he grazed nearby. There were reunions, small and large. There were stories told, and stories simply lived, quietly and without spectacle. The brothers became legends in their own right. Local artists painted murals of Max and Phoenix on downtown walls. A songwriter composed a ballad that found its way onto country radio. A podcaster, moved by Daniel's honesty and humor, recorded a long episode with him, giving space for Daniel to share not just the animal story, but his own battles with trauma, isolation, and the slow road back to hope. Yet, through it all, Daniel never let the fame change what mattered. He made sure Sage Haven remained open to everyone, especially those with nowhere else to go. He hired more staff, most of them people who needed a second chance themselves. He insisted on long, slow mornings, on letting people and animals find their rhythm. And every night, as the sun faded and the field glowed gold, Daniel would walk the fence line, Max at his heels and Phoenix never far, feeling a gratitude so deep it ached. The brothers' field was more than just a patch of land. It became the heart of the sanctuary, a living testament to the belief that healing, real healing, wasn't about erasing the past, but about standing together in the present. Children who had stopped speaking found their voices with the horses. Veterans who flinched at every sound found themselves able to rest, sometimes for the first time in years. Animals too wild for other rescues settled into new routines, their old fears slowly melting away. Some nights, Daniel would sit in the grass with the brothers, watching the stars appear. Phoenix would rest his head on Daniel's knee, Max's old, faithful eyes watching over them both. Daniel would whisper, "We made it, didn't we?" Not expecting an answer, but finding peace in the quiet. He knew that no matter what storms might come, Sage Haven, and the family at its center, had found a kind of forever. And so, with each sunrise, the sanctuary welcomed the wounded, the lost, the lonely. In the brothers' field, everyone was allowed to begin again. And in that small, sunlit corner of the world, the lesson was clear. Healing is not a place. It is a promise, made and kept, day after day, by those who refuse to let each other go. By the time winter whispered its first chill over the Nevada desert, Sage Haven was more alive than it had ever been. The brothers' field glowed green and gold in the weak sun, and even the coldest wind seemed gentler when it swept past the fences painted with murals of Max and Phoenix. Yet the true transformation at Sage Haven went beyond the land or the animals. It was found in the visitors, those who returned week after week, searching for something even they couldn't quite name. Word of Max and Phoenix's reunion, their impossible journey, and the sanctuary's rebirth traveled far beyond Nevada. It reached cities where concrete outnumbered trees, where loneliness pressed into high-rises, and even to hospital rooms where patients watched the story unfold on television. Letters poured in from across the country, each one a small piece of another life, another wound looking for light. The story also caught the eye of the national media. One evening, Daniel received a call from the producer of a popular podcast, one known for telling real stories that tugged at the heart. "Your animals changed the way people think about healing," she said. We want you to come on the show and tell the whole world how it happened." Daniel hesitated, but the volunteers encouraged him. "People need to hear it from you," said Maya, the first to call Max and Phoenix the brothers. "You're the one who saw it first. You believed in it before any of us." So, on a brisk Saturday, Daniel sat in a small studio, headphones over his ears, his hands fidgeting with a photo of Max and Phoenix. The host's voice was warm and patient. "Let's start at the beginning. Why do you think this story captured so many hearts?" Daniel paused, thinking of the long nights, the loss, the love that seemed to burn brighter in the aftermath of disaster. "We like to say, animals just act on instinct," he began slowly. "But Phoenix, that horse crossed 4 states to save his friend, and Max waited, he waited, even when hope seemed lost. That's not just instinct, that's love." The host leaned in, curiosity softening her words. "What do you say to the skeptics? The animal behaviorists and scientists who say there's nothing more to it than imprinting or stress bonding?" Daniel chuckled quietly. "They're probably right about some of it. There's science to everything, why animals connect, why trauma bonds can form. But I think that misses the point. When you see Max refusing to leave Phoenix's stall, or Phoenix carrying Max across highways and rivers, you realize there's something happening that goes deeper than survival. It's a choice. They chose each other." The podcast released a week later, and the response was immediate. People flooded the show's website with comments. Stories of pets who never left their owner's side through illness, of animals who traveled hundreds of miles to find home, of people who found hope because of a single, unwavering friend. Daniel spent evenings reading them aloud to the volunteers, his eyes bright with gratitude. Even the most hardened skeptics among them had to admit that something extraordinary had taken root at Sage Haven, yet Daniel himself struggled to put it all into words. He knew, better than most, that pain didn't simply vanish. His own nightmares still visited him sometimes, especially when the wind rattled the windows or thunder rolled over the hills. But now, when he woke in the darkness, he would find Max snoring at the foot of the bed or Phoenix outside the window, grazing in the moonlight. The simple, quiet presence of those he loved, animal and human, became his anchor. He saw that same transformation in others. One boy, Jamie, came every Saturday after his mother died. At first, Jamie wouldn't speak. He just sat by the fence, watching Phoenix graze, while Max lay beside him, a silent sentry. Over months, Jamie began to talk, not about his pain, but about the horses, the field, the clouds. His foster parents wrote to Daniel, calling it a miracle, but Daniel knew it was something simpler, a willingness to stay, to bear witness, to believe in healing even when you couldn't see it. A veteran named Carla, tough and reserved, began volunteering at the sanctuary. For weeks, she kept her distance from everyone, spending long hours mucking stalls and fixing fences. But it was Max who reached her, ambling over each morning, pressing his head into her hand. One afternoon, Carla knelt in the straw and cried for the first time in years, Max's fur catching her tears. She later told Daniel, "I didn't need therapy. I just needed someone to be there." Max never asked why, and that was enough. The lesson echoed in every corner of Sage Haven. Love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect words. It was about presence, the stubborn, day after day, refusal to give up on someone, even when they couldn't ask for help. Phoenix and Max embodied that truth, and Daniel learned to live it himself, answering late-night phone calls, comforting frightened volunteers, simply sitting with the lonely and the lost, when words would only get in the way. At a community gathering in the Brothers Field, Daniel addressed a group of visitors, many of whom had traveled hundreds of miles just to see the sanctuary. He held Max's collar in his hand, Phoenix standing quietly behind him. The crowd hushed as he spoke. People keep asking if what happened here is a miracle. Maybe it is. But I think the real miracle is that Max and Phoenix taught us to stop dismissing the emotions of those who can't speak our language. We spend so much time trying to prove we're special, to explain everything. But sometimes we don't need proof. We just need to show up, to stay, The crowd was silent for a moment, the late light washing everything gold. Daniel looked around, the children running with the goats, the volunteers laughing, the old friends leaning on the fence. He realized with a kind of humble awe that Sage Haven had become what he'd always hoped it would be, a place where love was ordinary, where healing was a daily practice, where presence mattered more than answers. The meaning of Max and Phoenix's story wasn't just in what they'd survived, but in how they'd chosen to live, in how they had found family not through blood, but through loyalty, through being there when it mattered most. The sanctuary was a living testament to that truth, growing stronger with every animal rescued, every person welcomed, every wound witnessed and respected. In the end, Daniel stopped trying to explain it. He just lived it, side by side with the friends he'd never expected, in a world that was broken, yes, but also, always, full of second chances. And every time the sun set over Sage Haven, Daniel would look out over the brothers' field and whisper, "Thank you." Not just to Max and Phoenix, but to every lost soul who'd found their way home, teaching him, again and again, that love, even in silence, changes everything. There's a hush that falls over the Nevada desert in winter, a peace that settles into every crack and hollow, stretching across the open sky above Sage Haven. At night, stars flicker like promises, and the cold carries memories as sharp and clear as the moonlight. Inside the main house, Daniel sits at his old wooden desk, Max's collar resting beside a stack of letters, Phoenix's soft breath audible through the half-open window. This is how the days end now, in quiet, in gratitude, in reflection born not just of surviving, but of understanding what it means to truly live. With Sage Haven thriving, people often wrote to Daniel, asking for advice. They wanted to know his secret, how he'd turned pain into purpose, how the unlikely family of a wounded horse and an old dog had inspired so many. Some asked how to fix their own broken hearts. Others wanted the magic formula for healing. But Daniel knew, better than anyone, that healing was never a straight line, never a formula at all. He would write back when he could, sometimes with stories, sometimes with nothing but a single sentence. Family isn't who arrives, it's who doesn't leave. Or, real love is silent presence, not promises. The truth, he realized, was both simpler and more mysterious than people wanted it to be. On the one-year anniversary of the flood, Sage Haven held a gathering in the brothers' field. The sun shone clear and cold, and a crowd, old friends, new faces, children, volunteers, stood beneath the wooden sign. Daniel spoke softly, his voice carrying not just authority, but the humility of someone who has been broken open and grown gentle in the healing. "Phoenix can't speak," he said, gesturing to the mustang, who stood in the grass with his head lowered, sunlight painting his coat gold. "Max can't write, and for a long time, I didn't believe in myself. Didn't trust that I could start again. But we all stayed. When it mattered most. We stayed for each other." He paused, looking around at the people whose lives had intertwined at Sage Haven. There was Jamie, the boy who had once been silent and now chased goats with a wild laugh. There was Carla, the veteran, who helped lead a support group for new volunteers. There were children, couples, old men with tired hands and bright eyes. There were animals, rescued, restored, reborn, roaming freely, safe, and at peace. Family, Daniel continued, isn't always the one you're born with. Sometimes it's the one you fight to keep. Sometimes it's the friends who don't give up on you, even when you've given up on yourself. Real love isn't in the saying, "I'm here for you." It's in being there, without words, without demands. It's in the long nights, in the presence that asks for nothing and gives everything. There was a silence as Daniel's words settled. The air itself seemed to listen. The children clustered near Phoenix, the dog napping in a patch of sun, the laughter, the quiet, all of it joined in a moment of shared understanding. In the months that followed, Daniel kept his own ritual. Each morning he'd visit the brothers' field before the others arrived. Sometimes he'd find Phoenix grazing, Max curled nearby. Sometimes he'd find only their tracks in the dew. Daniel would sit in the grass, feeling the cold seep through his jeans and think about what he'd learned, He realized that philosophers and poets had spent centuries searching for answers to the great questions of meaning, love, and healing. Yet what Max and Phoenix had taught him, what life at Sage Haven had revealed, was astonishing in its simplicity. Healing didn't require grand gestures. It didn't demand eloquence or achievement. It required only presence, only loyalty, only the will to stay, even when staying was hard. Daniel thought of the flood, of the fire, of every storm that had threatened to tear the sanctuary apart. He remembered the sleepless nights and the mornings when hope felt thin as smoke. He remembered Max's silent devotion, Phoenix's stubborn courage, and his own trembling heart that finally learned to trust again. He remembered the pain, and he remembered the joy, and he saw now that both were part of the same miracle, the willingness to remain. On a gray afternoon, an elderly woman who'd been visiting Sage Haven for weeks asked Daniel what kept him going. "Isn't it exhausting, always taking care of others?" she wondered, watching as Phoenix nuzzled a nervous child. Daniel smiled, the answer blooming in his mind like a desert flower after rain. "No," he replied. "It's the staying that saves us. I don't think any of us are healed because we're strong or brave or wise. We're healed because when the world gave us every reason to run, we stayed. And we let others stay for us." Sometimes in the brothers' field, Daniel would ask visitors a question, one he'd written on a small chalkboard at the entrance. If you lost everything, would you still believe in something? Just because it stayed with you, expecting nothing in return? He watched as people read it, some puzzled, some moved, some quietly changed by its challenge. Sage Haven became a kind of living answer to that question. The sanctuary thrived not because it was perfect, but because its family, animal and human, had chosen presence over perfection. People learned to forgive themselves and each other. Wounds became stories. Stories became connections. Every heartbreak became a bond, binding strangers into community, turning loss into loyalty, pain into purpose. As winter thawed to spring, Daniel sat on the porch and watched Max and Phoenix move through the fields together. Older now, a little slower, but as inseparable as ever. Children played nearby, their laughter drifting on the wind. Volunteers worked side by side, not because they had to, but because they belonged. Daniel closed his eyes, the lesson clear at last. In a world obsessed with what's new, what's quick, what's fleeting, the real treasures were those who stayed. The real gift was presence. To be seen, to be held, to be kept, even through the storm, especially through the storm. That night, Daniel walked the fence line one last time before bed, the moon bright above the cottonwoods, the scent of sage fresh in the air. He stopped at the sign for the brothers' field and traced his fingers across the carved letters. "We are saved by what we stay for," he whispered, feeling Max press warm against his leg and Phoenix nudge his shoulder. That's the truth of it. And Sage Haven, stitched together by loss and found in love, kept that promise. Day after day, year after year. For all who entered its gates, the message was clear. Healing is a presence, a promise, a staying. Sometimes the best answer to life's hardest questions isn't an answer at all. It's a quiet, unyielding, beautiful choice to stay. And in that staying, somehow, we are all saved.